my God, people were forced to choose between Andrew Cuomo and a Democratic socialist, and the Democratic establishment rallied behind Andrew Cuomo, who's the perfect foil for millennial Democratic socialism. And you could not get a worse candidate to go up against Zohran Mamdani. You couldn't get a worse candidate, period.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Emily Jashinsky, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
It's great to be here, Brad. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And you just launched a fantastic new show. It's one of my new favorite watches, the After Party with Emily Jashinsky. You and I have known each other for a few years now. Tell us a little bit about this new product and your career that has gotten you to this point where you're having after parties with Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly.
That's right. Yes. Well, thank you for the kind words, first of all. And the new show has been a lot of fun. It's only, I think we're in week 3 right now, maybe week 4, but just a blast. It's actually cross-listed on the comedy genre in your podcast apps. And
does that make you feel good about yourself?
No. And, to be honest, I looked at the charts yesterday, and I'm not saying this to brag. I'm saying this to sort of just convey the level of, I felt when I saw it, which is that we're beating like Seth Meyers' podcast and Stephen Colbert and some of these late night guys as of right now. And I just have been imagining some publicist out in Hollywood looking at the charts and being like, what the hell is this? Are you kidding me? But, we do an hour live at 10 p.m. and just try to unwind after the news cycle hopefully is over by 10 p.m. Mm-hmm. It is a noise, but it's fun. And it's you know this as well as I do. These news cycles are really brutal and they're really depressing. And it's a sort of unsteady time. So I think it's a real privilege to be able to just sort of let your hair down at 10 p.m., go live with really smart people and have fun.
Yeah, it's kind of the only way that you can get a grip on the news, because I think one of the things that I know you've talked to younger journalists about this a lot. I talk to younger journalists about this a lot, which is you want to get so caught up in the rat race and filing, right? Always be closing, always be copying, always be filing your pieces that you're so far into the weeds on whatever beat you're covering. Let's say it's like the latest in budget reconciliation on what they're doing with Medicaid, if you are covering the health beat, that you don't kind of acclimate yourself to where you actually are positioned in this media environment. And the only way that I feel like journalists can do their job well is to know where they sit within their own profession and to know where they sit in the political apparatus. And there's kind of something about like this fake professionalization that the industry has gone under for the last 60 years. That doesn't mean that I want to throw all the standards out the window, but like I compare it to if you're watching a football game and the football announcer had no dog in the fight, was never a football fan and doesn't really understand football, like that's what we're asking kind of our journalists to be when we call them neutral, objective observers of politics. Like, no, you were pulled into this political game because you had a dog in the fight. You were a fan of Donald Trump or Barack Obama, or you were a fan of Ronald Reagan growing up. You grew up in a conservative household. You grew up in a liberal household. And you wouldn't be good at your job if you didn't have those priors. And now you're brought in and you're like told to completely ignore them. And so I think that's what's been useful about the Trump era, especially in the media, is there's been a lot of oxygen for being upfront about your biases in a lot of different ways.
Right. That's so important. I mean, I'm one of the rare people whose first job in journalism was on the commentary side. The first real job I had in journalism was on the commentary side at the Washington Examiner. And so I never had to do the fake straight news reporter thing. And to be clear, I think like maybe one in every 5 DC journalists is the type of person who can genuinely shelve their personal biases. A lot of times they're people who don't have personal biases. They tend to be like the blue collar folks who got into journalism because they like talking and asking questions and muckraking, that sort of thing. But that's not most journalists who do quote unquote straight news. So I think this era has been actually really healthy. I'm very weirdly optimistic. I feel so strange about this because one of the reasons I got into media is I've always been obsessed with media. I've always been so pessimistic. But the last, I don't know, year or two, I've started to feel optimistic about media, not because there aren't still very powerful bad actors, not because some of the new actors aren't also bad, but because the demand for transparency from the audience, I think, is pushing us in at least a better direction, if not a wonderful direction, a better direction.
Yeah, and you mentioned the muckrakers of today, right? Like these are the guys who are the investigative journalists a lot of times. So they aren't actually, they like talking, they like asking questions, but they're not doing it in a public facing way. They're doing it once in a blue moon when they have something that really splashes, that really hits. And I think part of the reason that you see this decline in really high quality investigative journalism, whether that's on the left or in legacy corporate media institutions or on the right, is I got into this business because I like talking, but I like talking in front of a camera. Like you, my first gig in this business was writing opinion columns. And then it was, after I graduated, being an analysis reporter for the Daily Caller. And that is somewhere between straight news and commentary. It's this, I want to talk about a subject, but I'm also going to get sources on the record about it. It's not just going to be me opining, and it's going to be me telling you upfront about my biases and how I'm trying to read these tea leaves in Washington, because it's a dangerous and difficult game to do so, and getting people on the record about what you're seeing unfold on Capitol Hill or at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is always the best way to kind of round things out. And so, you see this kind of collapse in accountability journalism, and it's just all access journalism. And you see that on both the right and left. And one of the main tasks for journalists is to maintain access and accountability, right? Like if you're just yelling from the rooftops, justice, principles, et cetera, like you're not going to be able to do the work necessary. You're not going to have sources that you can cultivate or talk to because they know they're going to get burned. And so it seems like in the present environment, or at least in this environment where the audience demanding this kind of accountability, you had the scale way too far balanced on the access side. And that's really the Jen Griffins of the world, the Jake Shermans of the world. That's kind of really all that they care about, is getting that access and not so much the accountability.
It's their entire currency. And, a couple of months back, my colleagues at Breaking Points and I got some leaked slides from Punchbowl's pitch deck. So you mentioned Jake Sherman. He was at Politico for a very long time and then started Punchbowl with his colleague Anna Palmer. And basically their pitch to corporate sponsors is pay us tons and tons of money and we will give you access to Washington. Well, they're only in a position to make money off of that access because they're play acting as journalists. And they'll tell you that in this daily, let's keep the football analogy going, this daily football game in Washington, D.C., they're calling, they're throwing the yellow flag. They're calling as best they can. They're calling the game, but they're not. They have ideological biases, for example, in one direction, which is just that they're pro-capitalist. I'm pro-capitalist, but they're acting as though that makes them independent. They refer to themselves in this pitch deck as independent over and over again on their website as well. And it's just like, that's already, you've already tipped your hat that you are in favor of, it's not just capitalism, I should be clear, it's big business. They're already in favor of big business because they're doing all of this work with Google. I'm trying to remember some of their other sponsors, but it's people like Wells Fargo, Google, Goldman Sachs. I don't know if it's directly those, but it's many.
Well, I get the NatSec daily newsletter from Politico, and it's sponsored by Lockheed.
They were sponsored by Planned Parenthood. Their main flagship newsletter, Playbook, was sponsored for a week by Planned Parenthood a couple months ago.
Yeah, and what is that?
Well, I think the shame has gone. I think that's part of it. is that the shame is, to your point, there used to be a lot of access journalism, of course, but at the same time, it would have been really shameful for a journalist, 30-something, 40-something years ago to be caught in a way that was sort of compromising. Like, it would have been embarrassing within the industry. And, it's not to say, like, again, I think Walter Cronkite is often looked up to as like the gold standard, but Walter Cronkite was just different, right? Like, he may have been trusted by a lot of people, may have had some unearned trust by a lot of Americans, but that was just it was just different, right?
Yeah, and it was an era where he started out and trust in American institutions was unbelievably high. And we felt as if we could trust the information that the government was giving us. And by the time that Walter Cronkite leaves the scene, I mean, trust in American institutions had cratered, Vietnam, etc.
Yeah, and it doesn't have anything, it's not as though Walter Cronkite didn't contribute to that, by his own coverage over the years. But all that is to say, it just would have been so embarrassing within the industry, among your peers, to be doing what they do. And to do what Punchbowl does, for example, for a time, it just would have been like, that's gross. You guys see what we're doing here, right? Like, this is about accountability. This is about holding the powerful in check. And that's all out the window now because ideologically, they're aligned with a lot of people in big business who are in middle management right now. They had disproportionate sway in 2020, but they've decided the sort of existential crisis is coming from the American right. The American right is going to end the planet as we know it because of climate change. They are drenched in racism and words are violent. All of those things. That's actually still, I mean, it sort of seemed like there was a vibe shift in the last couple of years, but that's still what people at these big corporations believe. They came through the 4-year filter of college education, and they believe it. And a lot of reporters are aligned with them on that. So there's just not a culture of shame anymore.
So you and I have to compete with these people day to day. The people who we work with compete with these people day to day. And still, even with Republicans in power, Republican trifecta, these players, the politicos, the punchbowls, have more access than ever, it seems. I mean, it seems like there is a scoop coming from House leadership, Senate leadership for these outlets every 30 minutes. And, kudos to them. It takes hard work and a lot of time on the Capitol Hill and a work-life balance that I wouldn't necessarily be thrilled about. So kudos to them on that hard work. At the same time, like, why if this is what they truly believe, right? If they are still hostile to what the president believes, what Republicans believe, what Americans all over the country said very confidently that they believe in the 2024 election, then why do Republicans work with them? Why do Republicans work with people who hate them?
The very first question in the White House's new media seat, I believe, went to Mike Allen of Axios, who's a political veteran and somebody who has done sort of exactly what we were describing, access journalism dressed up as serious journalism, when it could just be sort of nakedly all about, the transactional nature of those corporate sponsorships and would be a totally different story, but that's not what it does. So the scoop about the Epstein case basically being closed by the DOJ and the FBI went straight to Axios on a Sunday night. Your point is completely correct. They're still doing this. The inside baseball explanation is that those outlets come to them and say, hey, we have this information. It's always a negotiation, always a push and pull. And they say, okay, well, if you don't cover this, we'll give you this. And I'm not talking about these specific cases because I don't have inside knowledge, but I think that's the ongoing explanation for why they run to those outlets, is that they're still trying to play that game. It's a game that the Trump administration, of course, is never going to win. It's a game that Republicans in the long term are never going to win. But at the same time, it bothers me less than it did in 2019 because the credibility of these outlets has just plummeted to the point where it's almost like it's not even harmful anymore. By all means, give Axios your scoop. More people are going to tune in to the coverage of how ridiculous that memo is than are going to click on the Axios article probably.
Yeah. And with that crater in trust for the media, the independent media has risen. People talk about this a lot. There's It's talked about as if it's like some sort of monolithic entity, and it's really not. There's people all over the spectrum there. And I guess I'll curb our conversation to two of these different lanes inside the independent media sphere, and that is the muckraker types and the commentary types. And so Matt Taibbi, for example, Twitter Files.
He's on my show tonight.
Oh, well, I'll be tuning in. You know, when we look at someone like Matt, I mean, why has he been able to be so successful in this environment? Like, what type of runway did the legacy media give Matt to be so successful in this? Because as I kind of see it, we're constantly debating, and as we're trying to orient ourselves in this media environment, right? Waking up, smelling the roses, figuring out how to best do our job in this environment. We're constantly caught between a decentralized and incredibly centralized media environment, right? If the centralization is coming from CNN and MSNBC, that's bad. If the centralization is coming from Google or Facebook algorithms or Twitter algorithms or X algorithms, I mean, that's bad. You know, you're kind of trading one set of overlords for another. Maybe the new overlords will be slightly more magnanimous or whatever.
Right.
And at the same time, decentralized, right? Like the nature of social media means that anyone with a phone can consider themselves a journalist. You know, you hear that thrown around quite a bit. You know, that space now. I mean, are we in a centralized or decentralized media environment? What has been the secret sauce for someone like Matt Taibbi?
Well, Matt's a really good example of that. And I don't even know that he did this intentionally, but he really brings his audience. He has a pretty intimate relationship with his audience on his Substack and really brings people into the process. And I think that's the future of journalism, is just in order to best establish trust with your audience and to best establish transparency. Because, you know, for example, I think it was 60 Minutes when they cut up that Kamala Harris interview. They've since settled a lawsuit over this. People were demanding the transcript. And I think that's the way people like us, our age and younger, want to consume news, is they really don't want it to look or feel edited. There's probably always going to be some editing, but they want stuff that's live. We want stuff that's transparent. And Matt is never afraid to talk about his process, obviously without giving up sourcing or anything like that. But with the Twitter Files, there was so much suspicion over this billionaire bringing handpicked journalists into the building's headquarters and, you know, reportedly letting them go wild and search the database and all of that. And I think Matt did a really good job of explaining how this happened from his perspective and what he did. And he still does that with a lot of his stories. And, you know, his success is also, and this is important, because he's good at the basics. He's a really good writer. He's a beautiful writer. And he's a really strong reporter. He doesn't give a damn, for the most part, about what his powerful enemies think of him. And those are just, we take for granted, but it's just be normal. It's weird to say that that's what makes a journalist successful, that you're a good writer and you don't care about the powerful people you're supposed to hold. It's, again, just normal. But he also, I think the transparency is a really illustrative example with Matt in particular.
The other lane, commentary lane, Breaking Points, great example of this. Crystal, Sauger do great work. Tucker, who was on the first episode of your show, Megyn Kelly, of course, like Tucker and Megyn is in particular. I mean, just Sauger started in more corporate news, and then him and Crystal went independent with Breaking Points.
They started with The Hill, yeah.
Yeah, they started with The Hill.
He started the Daily Caller.
He did start at the
Right.
Caller, but it's such that trajectory is interesting in and of itself. But like Megyn and Tucker were at the pinnacle of the industry.
Yes.
And now they're experiencing more success than they ever would have previously. I mean, that is remarkable to me. I mean, no one could have even imagined a world where Walter Cronkite did his own thing if the technology was there. It was just the news agencies were so powerful. I mean, why is it that you can still get the commentary that you want for a lot of reasons on these legacy media outlets, legacy media outlets, and yet still people are going to the independent sources? Because I think that the reporting is a bit different, right? Like Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Like, do you really think Washington Post is going to take a nutcracker to what Amazon's doing on a daily basis? Like, probably not.
Well, that's an interesting example because Bezos has since pushed the Post's editorial page to be open about having a free market bias.
Yes.
And I think part of that is an attempt to build back trust with the Washington Post audience.
Mm-hmm. And so like, you don't expect it from them. And so you need to turn, in a lot of ways, you need to turn to people like Matt Taibbi to get kind of that unfiltered, uncensored, I don't care why, because my paycheck comes directly from you, the consumer. It does not come from some corporate overlord, some sort of corporate sponsorship, et cetera, et cetera. But the commentary side's like completely different.
Yeah.
And yet Tucker and Megyn are doing fantastic. I mean, what's the situation there?
I mean, I think we're in the golden age of reported commentary, and reported commentary has always been a feature of post-war American media. So somebody like Robert Novak is a really good example, who was doing reporting in opinion columns for years and was very successful, and I would say a very additive person in the industry because of that. And now what we're seeing is obviously it's sort of, it's not the old ink-stained wretch art of putting together a column in every case. Not to say that there's no art to podcasting, but you're able to do reported commentary on the fly in a way that I think is even more authentic, and in a way that really resonates, because most people's media diets now are a combination. Even people like you and I, we have to be honest, of course. Like, for reporting from Kiev, I'm relying on what I'm reading in Reuters and the Associated Press, because independent media doesn't have the money or the resources yet to have bureaus in Tel Aviv or in Beijing or in any of these places. So for the most part, our diets and most consumers' diets are a combination of the corporate press and then the people who are saying, well, hold up, check out this that they didn't put in the story, or check out, and it's more work for the consumer, that's for sure. And not everybody is a well-rounded news consumer, but it's also on our feeds, right? Most people's social media feeds are not just commentary. Right. They're following NBC News and Tucker Carlson, and it goes right into your feed no matter what. So it's all a combination now in a very interesting way.
Mm-hmm. And you are also the Washington correspondent for UnHerd.
That's right.
Explaining American politics to British people. How is that going?
Well, we have a big American audience.
I know you do, but you still work with a lot of Brits.
Oh my
right?
gosh, it's hilarious.
And it's a blast. I ran into some Spectator and UnHerd people at the RNC convention in Milwaukee, and they're just like, all the fried cheese. Their mind was blown.
Oh yeah,
at Midwestern America.
Yeah, I have a funny story actually from that. I grew up outside Milwaukee, and I was at the Heritage Party, which was the best party of the RNC. It was fantastic, great spread. I had a plate full of like the most disgusting American and Western food. And as I was navigating this super crowded party, I smacked right into somebody who was looking down at my plate with just utter disgust. And it was Liz Truss.
That's amazing.
Like, it's honestly fair. I get it. It's a lot. But it's my understanding of British politics is as funny to them as their understanding of American politics is to me. And that's to say they're deeply knowledgeable about American politics, but also it's not a country where lots of people own guns. And it's like there's certain disconnects that are really amusing, and it's so exciting to sort of be part of the bridging of the gap. And I have amazing colleagues who do the same for me on the British side, but there are just certain cultural like our massive sprawling suburbs with big pickup trucks and gun racks. Right. And
the European mind literally cannot comprehend. Yeah. Is that what you're telling me?
I mean, sometimes. So no, it is very interesting. And they have so many similar cultural questions that weigh on their politics. There's been a really interesting series. We just had Mary Harrington. It was fascinating, in conversation with David Betts, because David Betts was on with Louise Perry and talked about the possibility of civil war in Europe or the United States. And some of these deeper questions afflict us in very similar ways. And it's really fascinating to see that.
Yeah. Enough about our industry. To the things that we actually have to keep an eye on to do our jobs.
All right.
The big, beautiful bill signed into law. I don't think I've come up for air in about 6 months since this whole thing started. This was Trump's best shot to get his agenda through after, I'm sure, a lot of angry phone calls from leadership on both sides of the Capitol complex, from the White House itself. They managed to pull this thing across the line. What do we make of this thing?
I think you started with a really important point, which is that this is Trump's best shot to get his agenda passed. So when you have very narrow margins in the House and a very narrow margin in the Senate, you end up absolutely having to keep a coalition together that includes Chip Roy and either Lisa Murkowski or Susan Collins. You're probably going to need one of them. And that means this bill is going to make everybody angry, no matter what.
Everybody's happy, everybody's unhappy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's exactly right. And so, what they need to do is get Chip Roy to a place where he's sufficiently satisfied, and they need to get Lisa Murkowski to a place where she's sufficiently satisfied. And in order to do that, both of those things are necessarily going to mean swallowing a very bitter pill. And it was always going to be the case. I think that's why Trump started from the very beginning of the process by branding this as the one big, beautiful bill, because he knew that it's going to end up being ugly. No matter what, it's going to end up being ugly. When you do a reconciliation bill and you stuff it full of goodies in order to keep a coalition like that together, it's going to be a mess. And of course, that's what ended up happening. I think that's why he branded it from the beginning as one big and beautiful bill. So my take on it as of right now is that the Populists lost more than the Murkowskis lost. TBD. I don't know. The immigration part of this, as Stephen Miller shepherded and has been branding this basically an immigration bill to save Western civilization, there's a strong argument that because of the provisions here, the Populists will walk away a few years from now as winners. But, we're asking a lot. I mean, I think you were asking a lot of Chip Roy to get behind a bill, even if we disagree with the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, that looks like it's going to add that much to the deficit.
Yeah. We'll return to the populist moderate divide here. But the other divide, of course, is Senate versus House.
Absolutely.
Different chambers, different characters. And I think that's one of the things that, because our politics is so nationalized, because senators are elected by the people of their states now and not determined by the state legislatures, that you get similar motivations and similar campaign styles between House members and members of the Senate. But the mentality within the institution is so different. I mean, it's night and day.
Right. Thune wanted two bills.
Thune wanted two. Well, and this is, so I really want to talk about this part. Thune comes out at the beginning of this process, says two bills. And essentially what we can understand from that was they were going to do an energy immigration swap. So they were going to save money on the energy side, and they were going to spend the money on the immigration side. Yeah. They were going to do $150 billion on each, get that out the door so that the deportations could ramp up. And then they were going to handle the spending cuts, Medicaid, and tax cuts situation for a second reconciliation package, because they have multiple bites at this apple.
Right.
That didn't end up happening. Trump says one big beautiful bill, but then shortly thereafter, he's like, it could be one, it could be two. I don't really care. They're going to be beautiful either way. But Johnston really latches on to this idea of a one big beautiful bill. One, why does he do that? And two, in recent days, he's been trying to dangle a carrot in front of House Freedom Caucus and other conservatives who weren't happy with the number of spending cuts.
Yeah.
For a second reconciliation package, which means he's in this weird way, he got what he needed to done, but then he's also kind of undercutting his strategy on the back end of it. Explain that to me.
Well,
because I've been trying to figure it out.
No, to your point, and I'm curious what you've heard on this. This is a little independent journalism on the fly as we were talking about. One of the things that I heard rumblings of is people reasonably did not trust leadership in a two-bill process to actually then bring the more populist bill to the table. After the first one is passed, you end up, the reason the reconciliation bill had that July 4th sort of informal deadline is because if you get too far into July, you end up cutting it very close with August recess. And there's not a lot of time in the congressional calendar after August recess. They have to do government funding, all of that sort of thing. So this is why Johnson, I think, was very nervous about the two-bill idea, is just the congressional calendar. But at the same time, I think the sort of HFC folks, the Freedom Caucus people, and probably the moderates too, just didn't trust that at the end of the day, if the first one was passed, that everyone would be motivated to get to the second one. I don't know if that's what you heard too, but I just heard a lot of distrust of leadership being like, if you do two bills, we want to do two bills, but if we do two I don't know that we're actually going to get what we want in the second one.
Yeah. There was two, you could say three, but it's mostly like one and then 1A and B. So the two major points of leverage were tax cuts and immigration and energy. And I'm lumping together immigration and energy because they are, as I said before, in a two-bill strategy for reconciliation, they would have balanced each other out. Those were kind of the two main points of leverage. And so if Johnson, I feel like, goes for the one big beautiful bill solution because he knows that that's the only piece of leverage that he actually has to get everyone to the table. And if you punt on the tax cut conversation for a second round, I think he thought the overlap of the Venn diagram between Susan Collins and Chip Roy on that suite of issues got too small to navigate.
That's a good point.
With what did it have to go that way? I don't think it had to go that way. I still think there was a Venn diagram there because the tax cuts just needed to get done. Like you just can't pull $4.2 trillion out of the economy via taxation, 12 months before an election cycle and expect to be viable. And that applies particularly to like the Lisa Murkowskis and the Susan Collins and the Mike Lawlers of the world who are very concerned about SALT and they're very concerned about Medicaid. But at the end of the day, like they needed those tax cuts too to remain in office.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I read that situation.
By the way, I think that's something people also missed. Is so that these tax cuts expire at the end of the year. So Republicans were facing the choice of either do a ugly reconciliation bill or let taxes go up.
Yeah.
So obviously they're going to side with an ugly reconciliation bill. And that's something I think Elon Musk missed in this question of why are you spending so much money? And why would you even do this? Because the choice is to let the tax cuts expire, have a lot of people's tax bills go up, not just the wealthy, but a lot of people's tax bills would have gone up. And then you're left with nothing.
Yeah. And then it's impeachments until we get another, presidential election in 2028.
You're letting taxes go up in a midterm year.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the option.
Yeah.
So.
And now, but even still, he's still signaling for this other thing. And I've asked members of House Freedom Caucus and some other conservative members, I mean, is this even real? And they're like, no, like all the leverage is gone. I think Johnson might have overstated the gap between the leverage that the tax cuts created and the leverage that the border security created. Right. Because I had members telling me that I don't care how ugly it is. I see over $150 billion for Tom Homan, Stephen Miller, and Donald Trump to enforce immigration law.
Right.
And I will swallow everything else.
Exactly.
And so I think that was an understated piece of leverage, actually. And we kind of overstated the leverage of the tax cuts, even though it was by far and away the one thing that everyone could kind of agree on that they needed to get done.
And I think Stephen Miller was actually frustrated by that, which is why he was posting about how it's a bill that could potentially save Western civilization. I think that's where that stemmed from, is they saw this as, it's typical reconciliation, but they saw this as primarily like an immigration bill. Yeah. And that would have been probably I guess it was a helpful way for House members and Senate I guess, senators as well to sell it back home.
Yeah. And the House kind of gets shoved with the Senate product. I mean, Ways and Means needs to start with all the revenue bills, but we checked that constitutional box, but just felt like, the House, this was a difficult pill to swallow for the House.
They wanted more time.
Yeah, and Johnson pulls another rabbit out of the hat, and the rabbit is big and orange and lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Right.
But even still, I mean, does Johnson walk away from this process a little bit bitter about how things went down with the Senate if you are the Speaker of the House and you've taken most of the slings and arrows for everything that's been put in the bill? Because the Senate can go, we're just working with what the House gave us.
Oh, yeah. It seems like right now there's a gambling provision in the bill. We're like a week after passage, less than a week after passage, and people are realizing they don't know. There's been some reporting to this extent. They don't know how it got in there. Like, it's just the process, because of that July 4th deadline, goes back from the Senate over to the House. And the president wants it on his desk for that ceremonial July 4th signing. And by the way, there's good reason for that, as we were talking about the congressional calendar. And so, yeah, the House just really got bulldozed into swallowing the final bill without any changes because of the timeline.
You mentioned the coalition that we see play out on the right in Congress, the moderates versus HFC, the Susan Collins to Chip Roy. And you said that the moderates seem to have won out. This is something that's interested me a lot lately, which is Donald Trump goes after Thomas Massie.
Yep.
But he goes after Tom Tillis after Tom Tillis announces that he's retiring. He was kind of holding back ammo on Tom Tillis until Tom was like, I'm not running for election anymore. And Donald Trump was like, this is great. Thank God Tom's gone. All this stuff. Another Republican election in North Carolina that will always have mysteries and always be fun to cover for sure. But I was kind of wondering why Trump uses his political capital or uses the bully pulpit in the way that he does. And I think, because a lot of conservatives get mad, like, you're attacking good conservative members of Congress and you're not, beating the heck out of Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski on social media every day. Why is that? And it's like, well, in my mind, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski gain credibility. It doesn't have the same effect as someone who claims the mantle of MAGA. Like, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are never doing that. And you're just going to alienate them and make their demands go up and up and up. And that's the best way that I can kind of explain why the populists seemed to have lost out on some of the major provisions of this bill, like, especially when we're talking about government spending. Win on immigration, of course. But is that the dynamic that you see when you're talking to folks on Capitol Hill? I mean, what is there anything that could have been done differently to apply pressure to moderates in your mind?
Well, I think in a way it's actually easier to get a Murkowski vote than it is a Massie or a Rand Paul vote. And so that's where they understand, if they kind of play nice and put some stuff in the bill, you're going to get one of them over the hurdle, and you're going to get Murkowski or Collins over the hurdle. And if Murkowski had said she's out, would Susan Collins have gotten to yes? Genuine question. I think probably the answer to that is she would have, because they didn't want taxes to go up, to your point. And they want to be able to go home and say we spent on the border. A very important issue in Maine, for example. So yeah, these things I think is true. I get really frustrated as a total nonpartisan in any of this, so much as I'm just conservative. I get so frustrated with the attacks on Thomas Massie because it's clearly creating this backlash to the spending. And it, I think Elon Musk has been shockingly naive throughout this process. And I do really think that it's naivete, thinking you can just kind of come into Washington and convince the Republican Party that has these narrow margins that they have to do some type of generational action to take on government spending, when the only way to pass legislation and get it to the president's desk is, again, to please either Murkowski or Collins and the moderates, while also pleasing the Chip Roys and the Freedom Caucus guys. So that was always dead on arrival. It was never going to happen. They were counting on Doge to help them with the tax cuts, to make either the $2 trillion or then $1 trillion or $500 billion in cuts that would help with the tax cuts. Didn't happen. But the attacks on Massie, I think, have made his point that there are priorities other than the debt, which is absolutely true. It's true for most voters. But it sort of helps makes this point that the Republican Party isn't as urgently concerned about spending as it probably should be.
Right.
And so I just feel like the whole thing has been counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. And it's, well, to your point, Elon is a good example of this because he comes from so far outside of the political realm and he's like doing all this for the first time. And Trump, his first foray into politics is being president of the United States, other than writing checks for candidates.
Right.
And you've seen Trump learn through this process. Like Trump in 2016, let's remember how big of a disaster 2016 was when Trump was trying to get his number one campaign promise done, which was build a wall on the southern border. Paul Ryan wasn't going to give it to him. Mitch McConnell wasn't giving it to him.
Yeah.
And they failed to repeal Obamacare. Like that was a budget reconciliation issue. And McCain gives his famous thumbs down. And the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is a recovery drive, basically, for that failure to repeal Obamacare. And it becomes the keystone of the Trump years. And it does lead to impressive economic growth. It does create a broad-based tax cut for the American middle class. It does all these things that Republicans were promising that it was going to do. And Trump returns to Washington and D.C. in 2024, and he's able to get the tax cuts extended and a lot of these other items. And that's what I kind of think, like, we can get really worked up about this, but we also need to put it into context where the Republican coalition in Congress isn't super duper different from what it was in 2016, 2017, 2018 when Trump was doing all this for the first time. And yet the administration is able to get so much more out of that budget reconciliation process. They're able to get the immigration enforcement, finish the wall, increase the deportation beds, like double the deportation beds, get the energy provisions in there that they wanted to. Was it perfect on the energy provisions? No, but they got a lot in, and it wasn't just we did tax cuts and that's the end of the story.
Part of it is spending post-COVID, both under Trump and Biden, spiked so significantly. And then Biden sustained a lot of the spending that it became exceedingly difficult for the Trump administration and for DOJ, for example. I mean, the explosion in VA spending post-COVID makes it look like if you go in with a hatchet instead of a scalpel to the VA in the year of our Lord 2025, that you are exacting a cruelty on some new scale, when in fact a lot of that spending didn't exist just a couple of years ago. So it set the baseline in a different place that I think changed the political calculation. But on immigration, for example, the politics of that shifted so significantly because of the Biden administration sort of going pedal to the metal. In the same way it went pedal to the metal on government spending, it went pedal to the metal on open borders. And that changed the politics. It changed the permission structure for the Republican Party. And in one sense, it was, on the spending sense, not helpful. On the immigration sense, it was super helpful. So it is just a very different time. And I think we often forget how critical what happened during the COVID years is right now to politics.
Yeah. And it's kind of the failures of the Biden administration is causing the Democrats to rethink their coalition in the same way that Trump rethought the Republican coalition, right? You think of the Reagan three-legged stool, you think of the social conservatives, the national security hawks, and the free marketers. Today's three-legged stool of the Trump Republican Party, the nationalists, the populists, aka the white working class, but now it's more multi-ethnic, so I'm just going to go with the populists more generally. And then the social conservatives still remain one leg of the stool. You can be all three of those things at the same time, but those are the three legs there. And for the Democrats, I mean, like the New Deal Democrats was a combination of elites, it was labor unions, and it was urban multi-ethnic voters. That's kind of that was the New Deal coalition, and you had the rural Southerners, et cetera, too. But think of that as the New Deal coalition. Today, you have someone in New York who you've interviewed now running in the general election, Mamdani. I mean, he feels like he is, whatever this new Democratic coalition is that's forming right now in the post-Biden years, kind of feels like he's the manifestation of that in a lot of ways.
No, I think that's true. I mean, it's been an evolution for him, which is interesting because ever the intrepid reporter, I did just an absolute feat of journalism and searched his Twitter account for the last time he had posted the word queer because it was such a feature of like 2020 democratic socialist politics to say that you needed to queer everything. Like it comes from academia and went straight through the pipeline into the sort of professional managerial class. And it had been a couple of years. He had talked about how defunding the police was queer liberation just a couple of years ago. And you never heard that from him on the campaign trail. And when we interviewed him on Breaking Points, it was shortly after the presidential election in November. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been out in her district trying to talk to people who voted for Trump and for her at the same time. So Mamdani did the same thing. And we were asking him about that. And he said the number one thing he heard from Trump voters in New York City, I think he was in the Bronx and Queens walking around talking to people, was that their bills were too high, that they felt like they had less money in their pockets. And so he went on to run a campaign where everything he did went straight back to affordability. He deflected and went straight back to affordability. He is still trying to do that right now. So, for example, when Donald Trump was leveling various threats against him over the immigration issue, which is one of his weakest, Mamdani pivoted the conversation almost immediately back to affordability. And I find that amusing because I think this mass influx of immigrants, especially to New York City, actually was a detriment to affordability and was part of the problem for a lot of New Yorkers.
Right, you drop $50 billion on housing illegal migrants. That might be a drain on the public fist. It might be a drain on the workforce, et cetera. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. But all that is to say, this is the lesson I think that young millennial Dems are taking from the last several years, which is take the pronouns out of the Twitter account if you're running for public office, because even if you never mention queer liberation, it becomes an insane distraction and people don't trust you. And that doesn't excuse what I think are very wrong positions on some of those policies. But it does make it a smart strategy to be more politically palatable. You've seen this on the Bernie Sanders Fighting Oligarchy tour. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has joined him for a lot of these stops. They are only talking about kitchen table economics, affordability. They're talking in the terms of class warfare, which has its limits in the way that you talk about it. And sometimes I think we saw this with Occupy Wall Street, didn't really connect with the working class in the way the Tea Party did, because Americans went on to vote for a billionaire. The class warfare isn't exactly what the left thinks it is, but it's a break from this obsession with identity politics, where even when they weren't talking about identity politics, like when they were talking about crime, policing, it had to be about queer liberation. That is changing. Yeah. And that's because of the economic circumstance millennials have found themselves in. It's because they've sort of witnessed and lived through the backlash to the censoriousness and come out on the other side. I don't know if he can pull it off, because he's just going to be battered with immigration and crime questions for the next several months. And I think that's a real vulnerability for him. And I haven't seen anyone pull that off in his party yet. I don't know if they can, but they're trying, and that's interesting.
And the New Deal, so we talked about the New Deal Democrats, like the urban voters, the labor unions, the elites. The new Democrats of the Bill Clinton era that kind of exists kind of until Biden screws everything up. Yeah. It's like the neolibs, women, and I would say progressives would be their own kind of leg on the stool, which is the LGBTQ climate folks. If you had to give Mamdani 3 legs on that stool, what is that?
I think he has sort of cultural libertarians, like a Dave Portnoy. I don't know that Dave Portnoy is pro Mamdani. I doubt that he is, because he's so rich. But the types of people who listen to Barstool and see a potential Republican opponent, and I'm not just talking about New York City, but they don't like where Republicans are on abortion. They don't like where Republicans are on gay rights, IVF. Those sorts of things just give them the ick.
You've heard of Barstool conservatives. Now you're hearing about Barstool communists.
Yes, exactly. Or at least, the millennials who have ongoing student debt problems into their 30s that have prevented them from home ownership or marriage. They've been on the apps, those sorts of things. And they have this cultural libertarianism that still makes them distrustful of a lot of Republicans. So I think that's definitely a bucket. The question then is, can Mamdani put them in a coalition with the hardcore statists? And I think what we saw in the primary is the answer to that was yes, because they hated Andrew Cuomo so much. People hated Andrew Cuomo. The other options were so bad that the guy who was talking about making life more affordable became more palatable. They may not have even known that he was Democratic Socialist. They may not have even known that because the way he talked was really focused on affordability. I'm very passionate about this, clearly, Brad. I'm knocking my water over. But all that is to say, so I think you have to bring the progressives in with the cultural libertarians, and then you need to bring them in with the suburban, well, not suburban, but upwardly mobile, affluent, educated, higher income people.
Mm-hmm.
And
which he did well with that demographic.
And to do that, you do have to do some of the cultural signaling, which is very interesting. And that's what puts off the Barstool conservatives or the Barstool voters.
Yeah. That's, I think that's a really good way to encapsulate that coalition that Mamdani's working with. And J.D. Vance over the weekend said the difficult thing about this coalition that he's trying to build is that you cannot replicate it at scale.
Right.
If Mamdani's able to pull this off, is this just a New York thing, right? He kind of ran a New York first campaign, New York City first campaign.
Yeah.
Is it just a New York thing? I mean, I think you see Chuck Schumer and AOC really invested, and a lot of national Democratic leaders really invested in this race to see if this is the way back. J.D. Vance has his doubts.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very unlikely that this expands beyond New York City as a whole. I think one of the things that now is going to drive Democratic politics is, you saw even the Pod Save America guys looking at this and thinking, my God, people were forced to choose between Andrew Cuomo and a Democratic socialist, and the Democratic establishment rallied behind Andrew Cuomo, who's the perfect foil for millennial Democratic socialism. And you could not get a worse candidate to go up against Zohran Mamdani. You couldn't get a worse candidate, period. So I think that's what limits it sort of to New York, is that so much of our politics now is lesser of two evils politics, and that always will help the Democratic Socialist or the Trump populist when the establishment foil in a race, in a primary, or even in a general election like Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris. Like, it just makes the populist that much more appealing. So that goes forward, but I think the likeliest case scenario is that Mamdani has a somewhat embarrassing defeat at the hands of Eric Adams, another terrible candidate, and that sort of chills the fever for him nationwide. But who knows? Who knows? He's a very talented politician.
Yeah. Does Eric Adams win and switch parties? It's going to be interesting to see.
Wow.
I think it's in the cards. It
might happen.
Emily Jashinsky, thank you for coming on the Signal Sitdown.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.